Hello, my name is Ann Cusack. I was born Ann Cusack. I go by Phương, and I'm married, so my name is Ann Nguyen. So I was born into a family that was a Catholic family. I'm one of 14 children. So I guess that my early life was really one of seeing my parents be of service within their church, and that obviously motivated me in terms of service to the community. And as a young person, I went to a teachers college and then became very involved in the community that way. And my first, should I talk about my first job? My first job was teaching in a inner city school, and it happened to be a Catholic school. And at that Catholic school, we had immigrants from many different countries. And right next to the school, there were 4 20-story apartment blocks. And in each of those apartments were either Indigenous Australians, Aboriginals, the poor, white Australians, or immigrant families. And so I got to know a lot of Vietnamese families and other families too, but a lot of Vietnamese families. So I guess that was really my introduction to service, because after I would teach during the day, I would go to the houses and help the women especially to learn English, because a lot of them didn't leave their apartments. And so that motivated me just to be of service to people. And one time I remember a friend whose name happened to be Thuy said to me one day, oh, you know, if you really want to know something about the refugees, you need to go to the camps. And a friend of mine who was a Jesuit priest, I contacted him, and that was the start of me getting involved in Vietnamese refugees. Well, I think you know, I graduated from Teachers College in 1977. So in 1978, I began teaching in the the school that was in the almost to downtown Melbourne, and it was a low-income area. And so I was teaching there and seeing many people of many different nationalities. And so that kind of motivated me, I think, to think of service in the community. And then when I met the families, the Vietnamese families in that thing, and trying to understand the story of the refugees, I had recalled that in my earlier days when I was at high school, that a man on my street, his name was Alan Pullen. Alan was serving in Vietnam, and I went and stayed with his wife while he was serving, so that she wasn't by herself with the kids. And so, you know, so that was kind of in my memory. I remember people being into the army, and that was so a lot of those things, I think, play together to make you think about something outside your own world. So and so once I met these families in Fitzroy is the suburb where I worked. Once I met these families, I really thought, you know, I can do this. I'm single. I don't have any dependents. I can do what I want, and you know, I don't need a lot to live. So that's so when I contacted this priest, and he put me in contact with someone in Malaysia, and I said, you know, I can be of service. And another friend of mine, Lucy, she was also a teacher at another school. She said, oh yeah, I want to go too. So the two of us decided that we would go and serve, and we got in connection with the UNHCR and said, you don't have to pay us, we're volunteering. And fortunately they said okay, and we came. And we went, and that was in 1980. I started in 1980, and I served in Malaysia. And then after Malaysia, after Malaysia, I served in Thailand. No, after Malaysia, I served in Thailand, and then the Philippines, and then Hong Kong, or maybe it was the Philippines first and then Thailand and then Hong Kong. I can't remember. From 1980 until 1989. And I came back in between each camp to Australia, and then I went back after a certain time just to continue. I don't think there's a camp I like the most. I think, you know, every camp had a story, and obviously Malaysia had the biggest impact on me because it was the first time that I had gone overseas to, not overseas, but the first time I'd gone overseas to do service. And at the time I was in Pulau Bidong, it was maybe there were about 13,500 refugees. So it was at that time was very, very crowded, and we would see boats come in, and and there were a lot of people. So it was an incredible time. And in fact, there's a lot of stories, but the person who made my wedding ring was a refugee in that camp, and his daughter was my flower girl in my wedding. So it's, I mean, just little things that mean a lot to me, and just think. But I think the impact is, you know, like the number of children who escaped without parents, then so unaccompanied minors, and then the stories of those who were met by Thai refugees, Thai pirates. You know, I mean, lots of stories, and the stories of families who lost family members on the boat or on the trip, or who met really bad weather. Because when I came to Malaysia, the first thing was that I worked in Sungai Besi, which was on the mainland. And then they wanted Lucy, and Lucy was the other girl, and a lot of people know her. Lucy and I were both there together, and then I was the one who went to Pulau Bidong, and she stayed in Sungai Besi. But I remember going there and being on the boat with people who had just arrived from Vietnam. And we were on the boat, and the sea was kind of rough. And a couple of hours to get from Kuala Terengganu on the mainland to Pulau Bidong. And the boat was rough, and the people were throwing up. Everyone was sick, and it was just, you know, for me, that was my first thought about, wow, imagine that somebody gets on a boat and they travel in a little tiny boat all the way from Vietnam to another country, and then I'm just going a few hours, but I imagined it must have been horrific for people. So yeah, so a lot of little things that, you know, just stick in your mind, and you know, it just has an impact on you, I think. Probably I have a lot of difficulty remembering students' names, but if they remind me about a story or something, then I can say, oh yeah, I remember that story. Obviously the people that I like, Tien is the man who made my wedding ring. He was only in the camp a very short time, but his friend was a friend of mine in Australia, and that friend, whose name was Lop, contacted me and said, my friend is in, I think, can you look for him? And I did, and I found him, but he was leaving the same week that I found him. But my family became very close to Tien and his family. And so Tien went by himself. His wife and child were still in Vietnam. And then when his wife and child came, my parents really helped them to adjust to life and things. So he calls my mother and father, he called them mom and dad, you know, so a very, very close story. Well, I mainly taught adults, so that was not a challenge, but it was, I think for Malaysia, the hard thing is that the soldiers were in the camp, and, you know, that is always a little bit difficult. For example, there were some women who used to wear beautiful things, and we're thinking, oh, okay, how do you get these things? But the soldiers were buying them that stuff. But that, you know, there were some things that weren't good. And I remember some fishermen, and one day a person came running to me and said, oh, you know, the soldiers have locked up this guy, and it was just over something very small, but really we had no power over that. That's a very difficult thing. You know, if you see someone getting slapped by a soldier, you know, you have very little power to change things. That for me was very, very difficult to see that. And, you know, to know sometimes that people were treated differently depending on the way they were with the soldiers, or how they treated other things. And then, you know, I think the sad thing is, like, for the children, the unaccompanied minors, that's a very sad story, you know, kids who came without their parents, and how they survived, or how they dealt with that mentally. Because remember, at that time we really weren't thinking about mental health in the way that we would, and for Vietnamese they didn't really think about that. You just get over it, right? You have to get over it. But, you know, looking back now, I think, oh wow, a lot of struggles for people dealing with that, people who lost their family members on the sea, or especially with the pirates. That was probably the hardest thing to me. Yeah, I don't know how you deal with that. There are a few people that I kept in touch with, I mean, that were, you know, if they came to Australia, like if I was in a camp and I knew that they were going to Australia, especially if they were going to my city, I would always say, okay, you can contact my parents, you know, if they need some help or if they need something. In fact, I was thinking last night about, you know, my mum helping somebody with their taxes. And it was just, you know, because when you come to a new country, right, that's something that you have to do. You have to do your taxes, but not knowing the system. And she would always help them to fill in their tax form and do that. It was very cute. And it was because, you know, they knew us from the camp. So I think, you know, to always encourage them to, one, that they have a story. I think that's really important. That I've always told people, you know, it's important to tell your story. Are people going to listen to it? Maybe, maybe not. But, you know, you have to own that. You have to own that story to one, to remember the story and to share it with your children or other people, but also, you know, for people in Australia or people in America, they don't know the story. You know, they may know, oh yeah, the Vietnam War, we know we were there, but they don't really know the story. So it's to encourage them to try and learn English, which is hard. You know, it's different to learn English in the camp and to think, oh, this is not really appropriate. You know, it's not really, it's hard to think about trying to say, oh, this dress is green or this house is beautiful when you're in a refugee camp, right? Or, you know, or thinking about going to the bank or something. You know, it's not really relevant, but trying to encourage them to be able to say things like hello, to say, you know, to tell them who they are, at least to be able to start the conversation. And, you know, I think, you know, as a person who's lived in lots of places, it can be daunting to think about trying to tell your story, right? But, you know, encouraging them to be able to share their story, firstly with their kids, and the kids are with them. You know, tell your story, and it's sad, but you have to tell the story, because if you don't tell the story, you lose that part of your history and your thing. What if someone dies? You know, in honor of their memory, tell the story. Or, you know, I think, you know, that, and even when I have lived here, is when I've taught English, is always telling people they have a story to tell and how important that is. Because for me, that's the thing. You know, you don't have to be a great writer, you don't have to be a great artist, but you can still tell a story. And sometimes the simplest story can touch a person that they say, whoa, you know, I didn't know that about you, or I didn't know, or thank you for sharing that, because now it makes me understand a little more about you, or about your history, or about war, about anything. So I think that's very important. So yeah, most of the time they didn't tell us, but we knew because someone would say, oh, these women are victims of rape, or this one, or and sometimes, like one person I knew in the camp, I didn't know about the story about his wife until I came to Australia and he was telling me the story. And that was very sad to see, because that really was like torment for him, how that, he just imagined that he would go back to Thailand and look for his wife. And, he would just, he just kept talking about it. And of course, that's, it's part of, right, a mental thing, just trying to deal with the tragedy of that is, the way he dealt with it was, I'm going to go back there, I'm going to find, these things. So often we didn't know the stories, but, like the people who worked in the camp would say, oh, they're victims of rape, or they're, so it wasn't something you would talk about, right? So it just, we knew that there were women who had suffered a lot. And there were, children. Of course, we knew about the unaccompanied children because they were all there on their own. So that was a thing. But yeah, those stories are hard. But I think once I got to know people, then it was a little easier to hear the stories. But even amongst I think people think, oh, everyone who was a refugee was this type of person or this type of person. But they were just really, I learned very quickly that it was different kinds of people. There were the educated ones, there were the fishermen, there were people who had been Bodoi in Cambodia, there were people who were just farmers. I mean, all kinds of people. There were the elderly, there were Catholics, there were Buddhists, there were Muslims. I think, we don't think about all the different groups of people that made up the camp. And sometimes, even the stories, the struggles that went on with people. I think it was in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, I had a terrible experience where I came to the camp very early one day, and when where I lived, I had to take a boat from Chung Chau to the island where I worked, to Chimawan, and I took the boat, and when I took the early boat, and when I arrived, I saw a man with a paper bag over his head being led by the soldiers, and it was because that he had killed his girlfriend. So you think about those things, and it's very devastating to see that happen. I mean, that happens, right? It happens here where people kill the people that they love and all that. But to see it happen in the camp is like, I don't know if the idea is so much more terrible, just because you know that people have escaped, they're looking for something, and for whatever reason he couldn't deal with the thing. So that one, and you feel guilty, like, oh, was there something I could have done to help this person, or or something like that. I mean, those stories are things. And even in the Philippines, I remember some boy came from North Vietnam, and the Vietnamese people were terrible to them, because they say, oh, they're from the north, they must be communists. And so that whole thing, and I mean, when you live with that and you think, well, the north is the communists, the south is all the good people, right? That was the thinking. But in fact, they were just people caught in the same situation. And maybe some people would not agree with me on this, but everyone is caught in the same situation in war. In war, there's no this side and that side, there's no winner or loser. Everyone's a loser in war, for me anyway. So yeah, they make me sad. Yes and no. I mean, I think like everywhere, people people in power, and it can be within the Vietnamese community, or it can be within the camp staff. You know, some people are going to take advantage of people and some people are not. You know, I mean, that's the truth. You know, in Thailand, the Bo Doi, the ones who came from Cambodia, they were, when my father had never flown in his life. He and my mum came to visit me when I worked in Thailand, and they met the young men who were what we call Bo Doi, right? They were Vietnamese who came through Cambodia. My father cried. Why? Because he had 9 sons. My dad had 9 boys in his family, and he said, you know, this could be one of my children, right? This could, you know, we don't choose, you know, a young person. Oh, you know, you're young, you can go and fight for us. You can go and fight for the communist people, communist army, whatever. You know, they really didn't have a choice, I don't think. And, you know, and my father had that same, you know, that sense of, wow, this could be my son, this could be anyone's child. And I think it really affected him greatly to see them, that they were just regular young boys who had been, you know, in a situation, and then when they got the opportunity in Cambodia to be able to escape, they took it. But it was difficult for them, right? Because when they met other Vietnamese who came from other places, they looked down on them like they were, you know, they were the enemy and things like that. And again, I know that people would say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, you know. But, you know, we saw that, you know, it's just people, in the end, you know, war does terrible things to people, and people get to be in difficult situations. And it was harder for them, I think, to resettle, than other people. Yeah. Too many, I think. I think, you know, for me, in Malaysia, at least, the times where people arrived in the camps and, you know, the people had died on the boat. There was a story where I think, I can't remember, only 1 man survived, but I think there may be 33, and it's just sad to think about, to travel that far and then you're the only survivor on a boat, you know, and you come to the thing and you say, wow, you know, and then you feel guilty, and that was sad. And I remember in Pulau Bidong that my first Easter in Pulau Bidong, it was Good Friday, and the Vietnamese Catholics, and I'm Catholic, right? So Vietnamese Catholics were celebrating Good Friday, and all the people went, all the people were kneeling on the ground, and there were lots of stones, right? It was really like painful to kneel on the stones. But I was thinking about, you know, and they were just there doing that, and I was thinking, you know, how difficult life can be, and still you can be thankful that you're there. And but it was very symbolic to me about the difficulty of life and how people, how people survive and come through that. So, yeah. So lots of stories, I think, you know. I mean, and my godson was born, my godson is Vietnamese. He was born in the camps in the Philippines, and I was lucky enough to be at his birth. And you know, the cord was around his neck. He almost, you know, he was choking, and then it was a Canadian sister who delivered the baby. But oh my goodness, it was, you know, I mean, the incredible thing of life, how many people were born in the camps and survived, and you know, had a happy life, and a good life, and that's amazing, amazing. So that's a very special gift to think of, you know, someone being born. And the girl, Bin is the girl, you know, she was a single mum at that time, you know, and it's very tough. It's tough when your family's there and you become pregnant and, you know, you have to, but she did it, and she was able to have a beautiful, healthy baby, and that's amazing, amazing. You know, I mean, there are lots of, I can't even think of how many stories there are of people and the way they survive. And, you know, people, I have to, you know, my Vietnamese name is Phương, and the man who gave me that name, his name was Nguyen Duc Yang, and a lot of people know him if they come from Nha Trang, because he was an educator in Nha Trang, and he had 4 daughters all named Phương. So when he really, like, I don't know why, but he really saw me as a daughter, and that's why I have the name Phương, and Phương. And, you know, he was just amazing, and he resettled in Denmark with his family. I was able to go and visit him in Denmark. And so, you know, I don't know, they're just, yeah, too many stories. And too many people good people who, you know, came through the camps, who are amazing people now. But, you know, every person, I think, if we have a chance, we always hear about the important people, right? We always hear about the people who made it great or something, but I think there are so many other people who have stories to tell that, you know, we're just regular people who came from regular places in Vietnam, but who have a story. And, you know, and that's why it's important to tell the stories, because we can do the famous stories, we can do the famous singer, the famous artist, the famous poet, the famous thing, but, you know, too many times we don't listen to the regular people who just have a story, and that's very important to hear those stories too. If I had the chance to do it over again, to be a volunteer teacher, yes, I would do that 100 times over. I mean, how lucky am I to be given that opportunity? Like, it was like a gift for me, you know. Was it hard? Yes. In my first year in Pulau Bidong, I ate noodles every day for a year, packet noodles. I never wanted to see a packet of noodles again, because at that time, you know, we had to pay for our food in the camp. So I paid for one meal during the day, and then the other I just had instant noodles. But, you know, I mean, of course I would do that, because, I mean, if I think of the sounds, if I think of the people who made banh mi, and the smell, and the people who would say "Chào buổi sáng," you know, they just, I mean, just things that I think of, or the radio, or, you know, people on the radio at nighttime. There was a big campaign, it's kind of funny, there was a big campaign in Pulau Bidong about the rats, because there were lots of rats in Pulau Bidong, and the first night I stayed in the camp, a rat ran over my head, and I just screamed, and I said, "Where's my mom?" I was thinking about that story. But they used to have a little competition amongst the people in the camp to, you know, which which area could catch the most rats, and then they give them a T-shirt or something like that. But it was interesting, because you think, you know, you make the best of the worst situation, right? So for them, you know, if we tell someone outside, they say, "Oh, that's disgusting." But for them, it was, you know, let's make something that we can do. One, it helps our environment if we can get rid of the rats, right? It's healthier for us. Two is we can make fun of it, and we can be creative in the thing. And, you know, so at nighttime they always had a radio show on, and then they would say in Viet, you know, wish everyone a good night. And it was so cute. They ran a radio announcement, and those kinds of things. I remember that. And then the Catholic Church was in Cusack, and then the Buddhist temple was right next to the Catholic Church. So it was very, very beautiful to think about that. And, you know, you think about I remember writing to my parents, and I would write like 14-page letters and writing to my parents and saying, oh my goodness, this is just, there are too many stories. And one time there was a big storm. We had to have water come in from the mainland to the camp because there was no fresh water there. So they would bring in things. And these 2 days there was this gigantic storm, and all you could see was the rain, and the trees, the palm trees were just moving the thing. And you think about the strength of a palm tree, that it moves so much, but it still stays standing. And if I think of that compared to a person, that's the same thing. You may fall back and forth, you may, be whipped and lose some leaves, but you still stay standing. And that's, I think for the refugees, that was, for many of them, that was their ability to stay standing, despite all the things, despite dirty water, despite the rats, despite being far away from their families and from, so many things. It's just, it's a lot of things. I mean, I don't know, it just, it's just a lot of things that I have in my memory that I think about people and their kindness, and just that people remember. And I always laugh that people say teacher, teacher, and you may have taught them one day or 1 week, but they still call you teacher, or, and it's funny. People are very gracious and grateful for the fact that you were there, and really I didn't do anything, right? I was just there. And and I think that it taught me that everybody is on equal footing. We just, no one is better than anyone else. No one has a better story, a better position. That we all have. We're all in this together. So yeah. Do I have any regrets of things I didn't do at the camp? I mean, obviously I should have done, I felt like I wish I had done more to help people resettle, because I think it's sad, especially like when we're in Hong Kong, because people in Hong Kong have been there a long time. Some of them have been there 10 years or more. And, that's just sad to think about that. But, I don't know. I feel like I tried to do as much as I could. I just, I'm sure that there are regrets, did I help everyone the same? Did I don't know. I just, I tried. I feel like I tried. So, what do they remember me the most? I think some of them remember me from like going with them on picnics for like Hung Dao, or the scouts. We used to go to the beach. Some maybe remember me from the church, because I was godmother to a couple of the people. Some would remember me for just helping them, or introducing them to my parents. Because a lot of people who came to Melbourne anyway, my parents would meet them, or check in with them, or the people I think about, like Auntie was the one who made my wedding ring, and Liu, who was from the Philippines, from the camp in the Philippines, she catered my wedding. I mean, and people say, wow, that's so interesting. But I think it was her way to say, I appreciated you being in the camp, so this is a way I can give back to you. And that was very, very thoughtful to do that. So I don't know. I don't know what people remember of me. So I just, what did I learn from them? I learned that that you can come through a lot of hardship and still be resilient. I learned that culture is really important to people. That even in, you're drinking coffee out of a little jar, and and a thing, but you know, you're still singing the songs that you were that were taught to you when you were little, and how important they were. You know, that they would have so much fun singing. I loved to listen to the music, and those things were really important to people. I also learned that it was, you know, it was hard sometimes to talk about the past, because the past was painful, especially when your family's still in Vietnam. I learned that some people were not as kind as they should be, and some people didn't treat others in the camp the way they should have been treated. But, you know, and that's within the community. You know, sometimes you go, as someone who's not Vietnamese, you go in and you think, oh, every Vietnamese person is wonderful. And then you learn that they're just like everybody else. There are good people and not so good people. There are people who are kind, and there are people who are not kind, you know. So I think it taught me a lot about life, that, you know, sometimes we have an ideal picture of, oh, Vietnamese. It's like when people generalize and say, oh, Vietnamese are great at math, and we know that's not true. Not every person is great at math. Or all Vietnamese are shy, and we know that's not true. You know, so it's just learning that the reality. You start with this ideal that everyone is this way, and then you learn that, yeah, it's like every community. There are people. But I think that being a refugee creates people, you know, striving much harder than if we just said, oh, here's a ticket, go to America, right? So it's different when you have to go through that experience. Some people survive and thrive, right? And some people don't survive that. It's very difficult for them. It's difficult for them to adjust. And so it's sad for me to think of, I remember one Vietnamese man, he didn't speak English, but he was sent to the Bronx in New York, and I just remember getting a long letter from him, and he was very depressed. And you know, and it's sad because he was by himself with his son, and to think about, you know, sometimes, you know, if you don't have a connection with someone in the new country, that can be overwhelming for some people. So I often think about, I wonder what happened to that man, because that's you know, a long way away to be, and to, you know, and when you don't speak English and you really struggle with it, that can be very difficult. So it's harder for people who haven't had an education, and then they come and they have to make a life, right? And that's difficult. So, and we saw people, I mean, I've seen people in Australia, and I've seen people here. Some people do well, right? They learn, and they get through, and they work out what they can do, and some people don't do so well. And it's, unfortunately, it's, you know, like many people who come from other countries, when they come here, it depends on their fortune at meeting with a support group, or, you know, being on their own. So yeah, it's so many stories I can. The first time I came here, actually, I came to do fundraising. I was working in Hong Kong with a group called ISS, International Social Services, I think it was. And it was a group based in Holland, or funded through Holland. And then we came to try and raise some money and awareness about the camps in Hong Kong. And myself and Lei Ba was also a teacher who came from the United States, but Vietnamese. Ba and I came here to do some fundraising, so and talk to a lot of people. I think our first stop was Người, Viện. We went there to do a presentation on Hong Kong and the boat people. Yeah. Well, I have to say that my parents motivate me. You know, and my parents have both died. So, but you know, that was you know, they were always people of service. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it is what I believe in, my faith, that, you know, we're called to serve each other. You know, that's our job in life. That's you know, that's what you do to make your life meaningful, is to be of service. You know, and we serve each other. You know, it's not me going out doing great things. That's the way, the best way a society works is when people serve each other, right? And you know, you have gifts that you can bring, I have gifts that I can bring, and when people see that and they offer their gifts, and then you will see a much better, a better lifestyle, a better way of living for the people, if everyone understood that. So that's for me, that's my motivation. If I had to talk to my former students, first of all, I'd like to say thank you. I'm here in California, and I am forever grateful for many things, but my 7 years in the camps changed me, changed my life, and I never ever thought that I would live in America. It's not something that I wished for or hoped for or anything, but here I am because my husband is here, and you know, I honestly, those years changed me. I think they changed my parents, they changed us. Our life became broader in a sense. You know, we had new family, new people that became our family, and you know, we're very. I just feel very blessed. It was, you know, was it hard? Yeah, sometimes it's hard to be by yourself. It's hard not to have money. It's hard to, you know, but was it worth it? Oh, nothing could buy that experience, you know. Would I like that people don't have to be refugees? Yes, that would be a wonderful thing. But for me, that it was such an experience. It taught me about myself and what I can and can't do, and just gives me gratitude for being able to be of service and to see how other people served me in those times. You know, very kind people are very kind. So I feel blessed. I'm lucky. So I think they're inspired by their father. You know, that he has an amazing story as a boat person and as a teacher and as a humanitarian. You know, he's done a lot of things, and I hope that in some way I've inspired them too. And in what I do, that, you know, that we don't, you know, we need to be of service. And I think that I remember both of them have been to Vietnam. So I have a son and a daughter, and both of them have been to Vietnam, and I think that gives him a sense of, you know, wow, we have a privileged life, and, you know, to be aware of the fact that there are people who don't have that same privilege, and even the fact that we can travel is privilege, right? So, but the importance of service, I think that they learned that from their father and from their grandparents, I think, and from me, I hope. That, you know, that we find that, you know, that's the only way to live, really, to be of service. So the wisdom that I'd like to pass on to others is that never doubt that you can do something, that you can make some difference in a person's life, and it can be something as simple as saying hello, right? That acknowledging someone, saying, I see you, you know, that you. I think that's the first thing, that even if there's a language barrier or a thing, you know, that you acknowledge a person, and you can be of service just by the fact that you acknowledge someone. I think, you know, many times I just remember this story, and it's not to do with refugees, but one day I went into a store in Stanton where I work, and a black man came up to me and he said, I know you. I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah, you gave me lunch one day. And I remember that. And so now I give lots of people lunch, but I didn't think about it. But for him, it was something that he remembered. And I thought, wow, you know, we never know, right? We never know what difference we make in somebody else's life. If you stop and say hello to somebody, you know, maybe you're the only person who says hello to that person. So you don't know, you know this because when people do things, they don't think about, oh, am I having an impact on the world? But, you know, sometimes you might get a letter from somebody, you might get an email from somebody, you might get a note from someone say, oh, you know, I remember you. And why do you remember me? Oh, you know, you spoke to me, or your mum helped me, or, you know, something. I think, you know, we should just be those people that do things. Not that, I need someone to say thank you to me. I don't need someone to say thank you to me, because many people have done kind things to me. I should be able to return that to other people. So I've been blessed that many people have done kind things for me, and so this is my way to thank them, by doing kind things for other people. So I hope that for future generations that they might think about their impact on the world. And it's that little mustard seed, right? Just, you don't know what you plant, you just put something and you hope that it's fruitful, and it is fruitful when you are kind and loving. And so hopefully we can all be kind and loving. It makes a big difference in the world. That's it. The stories of the boat people should be kept. Definitely. I mean, you know, all history is important. I mean, some history is painful, right? Some history is we don't want to repeat, but all history is important. So the importance is that we remember. We remember so that we don't repeat the bad things, right? But we also remember to tell the stories of the things that have gone on in the world. And it's so important. I mean, any person who's been a refugee from whatever country, and there are so many, there are Syrian, there are Yemeni, there are Vietnamese, there are many countries in Africa, there are countries in South and Central America. Any person who's been a refugee, who's forced to leave their country, you know, has a story, and we need to keep those, because that's the history, that part of the history of a country where people are forced to leave is very important to understand why this happened, and what we can do to make it not repeat itself in the future. And then, you know, just to think about the human cost of being a refugee, or living in war, or being lost to that's so important. So I hope that people understand the importance of their stories, and know that, you know, even if they haven't thought about it today, about telling their story, of simply writing a paragraph or saying something about why this story is important. Because I think the more we read, the more we hear the different voices, the clearer it is for us to understand the complexity of those who have been refugees, and also the history of the countries that we've left. So in this case, it would be Vietnam, but there are many countries and many stories to be heard. And we have to share the stories, because we can't expect people to know our story unless we tell it. So how do we tell it? We tell it through story. We're repeating it. It could be through poetry. It could be through art. It could be through pantomime or play or acting or movies. But, you know, it's important that we have all of these mediums to tell the story, so that people understand, and it makes people stop and think. And you think about, well, what if I was this person, or what if that was my experience? I think it gives people a depth to themselves to appreciate what it is, you know, about someone else's story, and to think of their own life. And, you know, what is my story? After I hear a refugee story, I have a story too. And so what are the stories that we have to tell? So telling stories is like, it's amazing. You know, every person's life is a library of stories, right? we have so many stories. I mean, we could write and draw and speak stories forever and never finish. But it's so important to tell your story.